Well, Joel, we are so excited to have you with us tonight. I've been personally really looking forward to this lecture. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Oh yeah, I'm glad. I'm excited to get to do it. Um, yeah, as a new to Pittsburgh person, I'm always excited about, any chance to sort of, uh, I don't know, lay down my roots a little bit, even if I'm doing it virtually from afar.
Hey, listen, virtual roots are still roots.
Yeah.
How long ago are you new to Pittsburgh?
So I moved here in September or August, actually moved here in August. So I've been here almost a year.
Okay, and from Toronto?
Sort of. I spent a year in Ithaca in upstate New York in between, but I had lived in Toronto for a number of years prior to that.
Okay, all right. Well,
Yeah.
I'm curious if Pittsburgh is more gray or less gray than Ithaca.
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say probably a little grayer than Ithaca, but I would say no more gray than Toronto. Like
Okay,
Toronto is very gray.
is it?
Yeah. And not so much in the summer, obviously, but I think that's kind of true in Pittsburgh too. Yeah, I would say when I moved to Pittsburgh, I got lots of warnings from lots of people about how gray it would be, and how rainy it would be. And indeed, it is rainier than Toronto. I will give it that. But it's not that much grayer. I was like, I feel very, very prepared for this, very equipped.
All right. Well, at least you were not coming to us from somewhere tropical, in which case you would probably have been woefully underprepared.
Yes, I have a couple of friends who moved from Southern California to Pittsburgh, and I think that they are struggling to acclimate a little bit more.
That is rough for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I just would like to welcome all of our fabulous Cafe Sci attendees this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Grummett, and I'm excited to be your host this evening. Cafe Sci is presented by PPG. It is also supported by the good folks like yourself. Thank you to everyone who donates to support this program. If you're unable to donate but would still like to support Cafe Sci, the most helpful thing that you can do is invite your friends to these lectures. Cafe Sci takes place the first Monday of each month, and you can register for next month's lecture at carnegiesciencecenter.org. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can ask questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can enter your questions at any point during the presentation, but we're going to hold questions to the end and we'll answer them after the lecture has concluded. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Joel Le Forestier. Dr. Le Forestier is an assistant professor with the Department of Psychology at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's the primary investigator of the Identity and Intergroup Relations Lab. Before coming to Pitt, he completed his PhD at the University of Toronto and was a postdoctoral research fellow at Cornell University. His research focuses on people's experiences in diverse contexts and what can be done to help people live more happily and more healthily in our diverse world. His award winning research has been published in prestigious scientific journals such as Science, Nature Reviews Psychology, Psychological Science, and the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Joel this evening, and I hope everybody enjoys the lecture this evening.
Hey there. Thank you so much for uh, for inviting me for that lovely introduction. Give me 1 second while I share my screen, and then we will be off to the races. All right. Um, so, thank you again. Both Sarah and to the Carnegie Science Center for inviting me. Like any of you who sort of were in a couple minutes early, probably heard me saying I'm new to Pittsburgh, and so thrilled to be at the Science Center today. Thrilled to be anywhere in Pittsburgh, and I'm grateful to everyone for joining us virtually today and accommodating me. I'm traveling right now. I'm in Toronto, and so. I appreciate everyone joining us virtually. With all of that said, as it is Pride Month today, going to be talking about some work that I've done over the past couple of years, as well as I'll be talking about some work that some other great researchers have done about this question of what being in the closet or out of the closet, so to speak, has to do with sexual and gender minority people's physical health. Before we jump right in, I want to say two things. The first is that it has been a really, really intense several months for a lot of people, inclusive, of course, of members of the queer and trans community, and also inclusive of people who do research on topics related to diversity. And so I'm particularly glad and grateful to be here today, sort of continuing to push this work and these conversations forward, even in the face of some headwinds. And the second thing I want to say before we dive in is that I'm talking right now in broad terms about sexual and gender minority people's health. You will notice, however, that almost all the data that I present to you today comes from sexual minorities, and even more narrowly comes from sexual minority men. And there are a variety of reasons for why, like, those are the data that are available right now. And so, at the end, I will touch briefly on what we know about other parts of the sexual and gender minority community as it pertains to these questions. And of course, I will be very eager to, field your questions about, anything else related to what we know about anything I'm talking about today related to other groups as well. So, armed with that knowledge, let's dive in. All right. So, like Sarah just said, my name is Joel Forestier. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where I am the PI of the Identity and Intergroup Relations Lab. And in the Identity and Intergroup Relations Lab, we study a couple things. So first, we study how people sort of make sense of who they are in relation to the world around them. So how we assign ourselves labels like, white people and black people, or gay people and straight people, and how we use those labels to help us, navigate the world and make sense of our place in it. Um, we also study how people experience interactions with friends and strangers who are different from them in ways that feel important to them. So again, things like, black and white or conservative and liberal, so on and so forth. And then lastly, we research the impacts that living in a diverse world has on us, and what we can do to help people live happier and healthier lives in the diverse world that we all live in. Okay, so that's me introducing myself to you. But on the topic of getting to know one another, I want to invite you all to consider how you would answer the following question. And that is, who am I? So, if I were to answer that question about myself, obviously I would say things like what I just said. My name is Joel, I'm a professor at Pitt, and so on and so forth. So just take a couple seconds in the back of your head and consider how would you answer that question about yourself? Over the years, I've asked a version of this question to um, certainly hundreds, possibly thousands now of participants. Um, the data that you're seeing right now are from one study where I happened to ask a version of this question to a couple hundred participants. And we had participants answer this "Who am I?" question by sort of filling in the blank. They could just type whatever they wanted into a text box. I then had a team of research assistants go through and code what the participants were telling us into themes, right? Reflecting the types of information that people were putting into their answers. So across the x-axis of this graph, you can see, all of the different categories of themes that the research assistants identified. And then up and down the y-axis, we have just the frequency that participants used those themes. So you can see on the far left, tons and tons of participants told us about their personality traits. So they said things like, I'm kind, I'm friendly, or I'm extroverted, and so on and so forth. Lots of people told us about their relationships. So I'm maybe a parent or I'm a good friend. People told us about their jobs, like I just did, and so on and so forth, right? People told us about all kinds of different things. Sometimes, though, participants will elaborate a little bit on their answers, and they won't just say, I'm a psychologist, but rather they'll say something like, well, I'm a psychologist, but I never really tell people that because, it always gets weird. They think I'm going to psychoanalyze them, turns into a whole conversation that I'm not interested in having. Or, they'll say something like, well, I'm Canadian, fittingly enough, as I'm coming to you now from Toronto. But I try not to draw too much attention to it because I am just not interested in having conversations about geopolitics, right? Or whatever. In other words, participants in my studies and in my lab studies seem to be thinking really, really hard about how to answer this question of who am I? And in particular, they seem to be thinking really hard about how they tweak their answer to it, depending on the context that they're in, the audience they're answering it in front of, and so on and so forth. Tweaking it in ways to help them navigate, challenging interpersonal contexts, like avoiding awkward conversations about geopolitics. Um, in other words, to put it more briefly, people answer this question, "Who am I?" differently depending on who they are around. Now, those are a couple kind of silly examples, but it turns out that they actually represent a much, much broader phenomenon. Um, in the social scientific literature, rather, we call it concealing an identity. Colloquially, we might call this being in the closet. Um, Identity concealment is what you're doing when you take some piece of information that you feel describes a portion of who you are. So that could be your sexual orientation or your religion, your age, your occupation, or something else. And you purposefully keep that piece of information to yourself, right? That is, you purposefully try to keep other people from finding out that that label or that group applies to you. Lots of different types of people conceal lots of different types of things for lots of different types of reasons. But it is particularly common for sexual and gender minorities. And the most common reason that sexual and gender minorities conceal their sexual orientations and gender identities is because they feel stigmatized and they want to avoid facing prejudice, discrimination, or even violence. So today, like I mentioned earlier, as it is Pride Month, I am going to be talking about some of my research with sexual minorities in particular and what happens for their physical health when they conceal their sexual orientations. That is, what happens when they stay in the closet. One quick note, though, before we jump all the way in, which is that, colloquially, we tend to talk, as I have been doing, about being, in the closet or out of the closet as though it's this binary thing, right? Either you're, totally in the closet and you keep your identity completely hidden all the time from everyone, no matter what. Or you are out of the closet and everyone knows your identity all the time in all contexts. Um, but in reality, like most things, concealment exists on a spectrum, and most people fall somewhere in the middle, right? That means that some of the time, to some people in some domains of their lives, they feel more in the closet, or they are more in the closet, and in other domains of their lives, or at other times, they don't conceal; they're less in the closet. You'll see this theme reflected throughout all the studies that I'm going to talk about today, right? The way that concealment is conceptualized as how much we conceal something rather than whether or not someone conceals it. That's the way that most psychologists think about concealment, and it's how we'll be talking about it today. So now that you have that in mind, we can move forward and everything else will make more sense. Okay, so we're doing all this talking about being in the closet and concealing, but why do people actually choose to be in the closet to begin with, right? I mean, surely common sense and most people's intuition dictates that it must feel better, to live, fully out in the open as your full authentic self and so on and so forth. And indeed, most of the evidence is consistent. That is what most members of sexual and gender minority communities desire for themselves, is to be able to be totally out of the closet. Um, so why do people conceal? These are some data from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation from a couple years ago. They asked participants, in the last year, so in the last 12 months, have you experienced threats or harassment targeting you because of your sexual orientation or your gender identity? And among sexual and gender minorities, over half said yes. In just 1 year, they have experienced some form of threat or harassment. And these were data from 2018, so not an incredibly different time from now. Um, in some of my own data, when I ask participants how much they conceal or to what extent they conceal, almost all of the sexual and gender minority participants say that they conceal at least a little bit, at least some of the time. 94% in this particular study said that they conceal their sexual orientation or their gender identity at least some of the time. And only 6% said that they never conceal. And when we ask them why, it's these types of experiences, of threats and harassment, or it's anticipating those types of experiences that they might have them in the future, that leads them to conceal, right? They say, I don't want to make myself vulnerable to these types of threats or this type of harassment, this type of prejudice, discrimination. And so, sometimes, if I'm not feeling safe in a particular context, I decide to keep it to myself. Downplay any cues that might be there that I might be gay or whatever it may be, to prevent people from finding out. So people conceal their identities in response to facing things like prejudice and discrimination. And to be fair, it seems like that strategy might work. In some of my own studies, we find that people whose identities are more concealable, so people who think that they would do a better job passing as straight if they tried to do so, they say that they feel less anxious when they're interacting with members of majority groups. So, for example, interacting with straight people. So, a gay person, for example, who thinks that they could pass as straight, they could pull off coming off as straight if they wanted to, feels less anxious than a different gay person who thinks that it's not within their capabilities to pass as straight. As a consequence of that, we find that members of minority groups like gay people feel more comfortable initiating intergroup interactions with majority group members like straight people and end up having more diverse friendship networks as a result. They have more integrated friendship networks when they feel that their identities are more concealable. At the same time, though, concealment is not without its negative consequences. So we also know that when someone perceives you as having concealed something about yourself, they make some really, negative inferences about that. They perceive that as being an immoral act to conceal something about yourself, and they perceive it as being an unsociable thing to do. Um, and we also know that concealing can even have some pretty severe, in some cases, consequences for both people's mental and physical health. Uh, so, to sort of wrap or summarize where we've been so far, stigmatized people or members of stigmatized groups are thinking really, really hard about the way they answer this question, who am I, and how they tweak their answer to it in different contexts. And many people choose to answer it in a way that specifically withholds information in order to keep themselves safe from the consequences of being stigmatized. That concealment that they're engaging in has a whole range of both positive and negative consequences. And today I'm going to be talking about one of those consequences that I think is particularly important and is particularly close to my heart, and that is consequences for people's physical health. Now, we've known for a very long time that concealment is associated with worse health among sexual minorities, at least. Probably one of the most striking early examples of this type of finding was published all the way back in 1996, using data that these researchers collected during the AIDS epidemic. So what these researchers did was they studied a group of several hundred HIV positive sexual minority men in America for about a decade. And one of the things that they found that really surprised them at the time, because this was a brand new research area at the time, was that the men who were relatively more out of the closet, that is, the men who concealed a little bit less, they ended up having better health outcomes related to their HIV diagnosis compared to the men who were relatively more in the closet. This graph that you're looking at here is a little hard to read. Data visualization has come a long way since the 90s. But basically, what this is telling you is that they found that men who were more in the closet had their HIV progress to age, which is a key sort of benchmark in people's health decline when they have HIV. So the HIV progressed to AIDS within about 3 to 5 years on average, if they were relatively more in the closet. Whereas men who were mostly out of the closet, for them, it took more like 6 to 8 years. So almost twice as long for their health to decline if they were more out of the closet compared to if they were more in the closet. Soberingly, the same type of finding also applied for their longevity. So, men who were more in the closet, men who concealed more, they were likely to die around 6 years, and this is sort of 6 years after the study began. So, 6 years after enrolling in the study, on average, is when they were most likely to die. Whereas for men who were relatively more out of the closet, right, for men who concealed less, it was more likely to happen around year 8. So, It's important to note, of course, that today, HIV is not a death sentence the way that it was in decades gone by, and that is great news. But it is nonetheless striking that identity concealment seemed to have something to do with how bad things got for people who were living with HIV and how quickly it got that bad. We can't exactly infer causality from these data. That is, we can't say that being in the closet or out of the closet caused these sexual minority men's HIV to progress to AIDS faster, for example. Right? These are just observational data. Although I should say credit where credit is due to this team of researchers that I was not on. So, I'm not bragging. This is them. They were very, very careful to rule out, lots of possible confounds by selecting control variables very carefully. And so what the authors ended up concluding here is that even if they weren't able to pin down causality precisely, it seemed like being open about your sexual orientation might be good for your health, and that being closed off about your sexual orientation might be bad for your health. Okay, so there might be something about concealment that is bad for our health. Now that obviously is a really, really troubling finding, and also for a lot of people a pretty, unintuitive finding. And so for me, that body of research that sort of grew out of those early findings felt like it raised a lot more questions than it answered. For example, for which health outcomes does concealment or might concealment undermine health? Is it going to get if you are relatively more in the closet, if you conceal more, are you going to get the flu more often? Is it going to give you osteoporosis, right? Like what's going on under the hood with which specific health outcomes this is undermining? And equally interesting is why is it undermining these health outcomes, right? I think it's unlikely that concealment is just having a direct effect on people's physical health, right? You conceal something and now you get the flu more, right? Like that doesn't seem plausible to me, and I don't think that seems plausible to very many people. So there has to be something else going on in the middle here, right? Concealment might be causing one thing, and then that thing goes on to cause declines in people's physical health. At least that's what seems more likely to me. So these are the two questions that are going to guide, our discussion today, right? Why might concealment undermine health? And so, what is that thing that comes in between concealment and health that explains what's going on here? And which health outcomes might concealment undermine? Which specific types of health are at play here? We're going to start, fittingly enough, with the first of these questions. Okay, so a little bit of a spoiler alert. I am going to propose to you today that one reason that concealment might undermine health is because when we conceal our identities, we cut ourselves off from our communities, right? So if I, as a gay person, for example, am concealing the fact that I'm gay, then I'm going to be cutting myself off from the gay community. Um, but, why would cutting yourself off from your community matter for your health? To get us started thinking about that, I want you to answer a couple questions for me, and you can answer them just, to yourself. So find a scrap piece of paper, or you can just do this on your computer, whatever's easiest for you. I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and I'm going to ask that you, write down your answers just for yourself. I won't ask you to share. This is totally private. Okay, so the first question, or it's actually more of a prompt, not a question, is I'm going to ask you to write down a list of the 5 to 10 people that you are closest to in your life. So these could be your best friends, your close family members, your neighbors, whoever you feel closest to in your life. And try, if you can, to write them down in order from closest to least close. So at the top of your list is, your very, very best friend in the world. And at the bottom of the list is, the person that you are fifth or 10th closest to, or however far you can get. I'm going to give you about a minute and a half to do this. So this orange clock will disappear at the end of a minute and a half, and then we will regroup. So go ahead and get started now. however far you got there on your list. We'll pause there for the moment. Um, so now I have a couple questions for you about the people that you listed. Again, you can just answer for yourself on paper or on your computer. I'm not going to ask you to share these out loud. So the first question is, who of the people on your list would you reach out to if you had good news to celebrate? So just nominate one or two people on your list, maybe put a star beside their name on your list. Who would you reach out to if you had good news to celebrate? The second is, who would you reach out to if something went wrong and you needed support? If you needed help, who would you ask for help? Again, just nominate one or two people on your list, put a little shape beside their name. And third, who would you reach out to if you wanted to learn something new? And of course, I assume it depends on what exactly you needed to learn, but bear with me for the sake of argument. If you needed to learn something new, who do you think would be most likely to be able to help you out? If you're like most people, when you were answering the first two questions, you probably nominated people near the top of your list, right? So people who you're quite close to. Um, Typically, when we want to have a good time or when we're going through a bad time, we usually go to our best friends, or our closest family members, or whoever for you are the closest people in your lives. For question three, though, I have no idea who you might have answered. Maybe you also nominated people near the top of your list. Maybe you nominated people near the bottom. People go to all kinds of different people when they need information. They need to learn something new. The research shows that, though, that if you want to learn something new, sometimes it's those people who are nearer the bottom of your list that can be the most helpful for you. That's because we already know most of the things that our best friends know, right? We talk to our best friends all the time. So we've already heard a lot of the things that they have to say. So when you need new information that you haven't already heard before, information you don't already have, it's often not your very best friend who is most likely to have that information, but rather it's people in the broader social network you're enmeshed within. This is something that researchers call the strength of weak ties, which is just a phrase that means sometimes our weaker social connections, so all of the people in our broad social network rather than our best friends specifically, bring some real strengths to the table that can teach us things we don't already know. So far I've introduced a couple different ideas to you, and here is where I'm going to put them all together and the rubber's really going to hit the road. A few minutes ago, I mentioned to you that today I'm going to propose this idea that concealment might undermine our health because it cuts us off from our communities. What I mean by that is, that gay people, for example, are going to have fewer gay friends and feel like they're less a part of the gay community if they are concealing their sexual orientation than if they are not concealing their sexual orientation. Same thing goes for bisexual people, for queer people, for trans people. That's true for just about everyone. Um, but when you get cut off from that community of people who are like you in important ways, that means that you're also being cut off from all the things that that community might otherwise do for you. One of them, like I've just been talking about, is delivering you information. And one type of information, one type of particularly important information is health information, right? Where are the good doctors who understand the needs of people like me? Where's the nearest vaccine clinic? What types of viruses are circulating these days that might impact people like me? Like these are the types of conversations that you're less likely to have if you're not part of a strong community. And of course, if you're not getting health information, you can't use it to protect your health, right? You can't act on that information in any way. So this sort of, four-step process, this is the big picture idea that we're working with today. So this strength of weak ties, right? The fact that the broader community that you're part of, and not just our very best friends, bring some strengths to the table, might be one reason that concealment might undermine health. Right? Maybe when people conceal, they're cut off from their community, they don't get information about health resources circulating within that community, and they can't take advantage of those health resources. It was a couple years ago. It was in 2022, so 3 years ago, that I was initially sort of, rolling this idea around in my head. And as I was starting to think it through, something happened in the world that presented itself as both a social issue that we needed to understand, as well as an opportunity to test this idea as a researcher. Um, In May of 2022, there was a global outbreak of Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, if you know it better by that name. So starting in May 2022, there was this global outbreak. By July of that year, the World Health Organization had declared the 2022 global Mpox outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, which is the highest level of alert issued by the World Health Organization. By the end of the first major wave of this outbreak, unfortunately, there were some follow-up waves, but by the end of the first major wave, this outbreak had infected almost 100,000 people in 116 different countries, leading to hundreds of deaths. Now, although anyone, of course, can get infected with Mpox, a unique and important feature of this particular outbreak was that it was almost entirely concentrated among gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men. Now, cast your mind back to spring, summer of 2022, right? We are fresh off the heels of COVID. And so, as you can imagine, public health officials were absolutely frantic. They were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do to prevent Mpox what to do to prevent Mpox from becoming the next COVID. And so one of the first things that they were doing was they were urging people who are at risk, who are primarily sexual minority men, to get vaccinated. We were lucky in this case that there was a pre-existing vaccine. And so that led to, this sort of state of affairs, long, long lineups all over the world of predominantly sexual minority men waiting to access Mpox resources like vaccines. These photos are taken from newspaper magazine articles, and these clinics were in New York, Chicago, and Toronto. Um, Now, one thing that is, interesting about Mpox being concentrated among sexual minority men is that this is a group where we know that it is common for people to conceal their sexual orientations. So, as the outbreak was unfolding in spring and summer of 2022, I ran a study to try to understand whether sexual minority men who were concealing their sexual orientations would be less likely to be able to take advantage of health resources that were available to them, like vaccine doses in particular. So, I ran the study as the outbreak was unfolding to test whether sexual minority men who concealed their sexual orientations would be less likely to get vaccinated. So, for this study, I collected data in four countries. This were the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and Australia. These are four large English-speaking countries that were experiencing substantial outbreaks at the time of data collection. Um, and I collected these data in two waves. This graph that you're seeing shows the two waves of data collection along sort of the trajectory of the first wave of the outbreak. So along the x-axis here, we have time, so from May to November of 2022. And then up and down the y-axis, we have the number of new daily confirmed cases. So the number of new cases first detected that day in these four countries. So you can see that the outbreak peaked in around August, and that's where we collected our time one data set. So we recruited a sample of 864 sexual minority men in August of 2022. That's that thin gray bar that you're seeing in the middle of the plot there. And then that thicker gray bar you're seeing about 2 months later, that's our time two data set. So about 2 months later, we recontacted as many of the same men from time one as we could so we could get a second wave of data from those same men. So at time one, we were asking people about their experiences during the outbreak, things like how much do you conceal your sexual orientation these days? And then by the end of the outbreak, at time two, we were asking people about their outcomes related to Mpox. So did you get vaccinated against Mpox, for example? As a reminder, we were looking to see whether there would be a relationship between how much people concealed and how likely they would be to get vaccinated. And this is what we found. So, along the x-axis here, you're seeing how much participants reported concealing, where higher numbers indicate that they concealed more, lower numbers indicated that they concealed less. And up near the y-axis here, we have the probability that our model estimated a participant would have of getting a vaccine to protect against Mpox. We found a relationship between these two things, such that the more someone concealed, the less likely they would be to report getting a vaccine. Specifically, our model predicted that for someone who is at the scale minimum of concealment, so for someone who told us that they didn't conceal their sexual orientation at all, our model predicted that they would have an 11% chance of having received a vaccine to protect against Mpox by the end of the outbreak. Whereas for someone who is at the scale maximum of concealment, for someone who said they concealed their sexual orientation all the time, completely, our model predicted that they would have less than a 1% chance of having received a vaccine to protect against Mpox by the end of the outbreak. And so if this, a 10 and a bit percent difference doesn't seem enormous to you, that's fair enough. But I'd invite you to consider that, we're very, very fortunate that this particular wave of the Mpox outbreak ended up being pretty narrow. So our study window here was only 2 months, and there were severe vaccine shortages at the time. So an 11% vaccination rate would have been a tremendous public health victory, whereas a less than 1% vaccination rate would have been just a catastrophic public health failure, right? Probably more people would have died if we had had a less than 1% vaccination rate at that time. Fortunately, the vaccination rate was somewhere between these two figures at the time. Um, Okay, so we're seeing this relationship, right, between concealment and people making use of a health resource that's available to them. But what is driving this relationship? Why is it that people who conceal more are making more use of this? Of course, these are observational data. So again, like the last study that I showed you, we can't necessarily infer causality from this. So I cannot say that because someone concealed, they didn't get a vaccine, right? That's not what we can say from these data. But I did check to see if it was any of the, obvious potential alternative explanations. So, were there differences in how much people who did or didn't conceal, how much they engaged in behaviors that we knew were high risk for Mpox, right? That may make them more or less motivated to get a vaccine. And we found that there were no differences there. We looked at whether or not there were differences in how concerned people were about Mpox, how big a deal they thought Mpox was, and we found no differences there. We tried controlling for all kinds of different demographics, and again, nothing seems to make this relationship go away. So, what is explaining this relationship between concealment and vaccination if it's none of those things? Well, I tested a model reflecting the idea that I've been talking about so far today. So specifically, that when you conceal something, you feel, less connected, or you are less connected to your in-group community. So again, if you're a gay person, that means you're less connected to the gay community. Um, but that, otherwise being connected to that community might have helped connect you to important knowledge, helped give you new information. In this case, knowledge about the fact that vaccines were available and where to go to get those vaccines. And of course, if you have that knowledge, then you're presumably going to be more likely to be able to act on it. And we actually did find support for this model. So, statistically speaking, the relationship between concealment and vaccination seems to be explained by differences in community connectedness and resource knowledge. What this means is when we conceal an identity, for example, the fact that you're bisexual, let's say, you cut yourself off from that community somewhat, right? So you're less connected to a community of other bisexual or other sexual minority people. And when that happens, that means that you're less likely to have lots of, bisexual or other sexual minority friends. You're less likely to be in group chats full of other sexual minority people. You're less likely to be hanging out at queer bars and so on and so forth. And so, if a specific piece of health information, like the fact that Mpox is circulating and there are vaccine clinics popping up that you can go to, if that information is primarily circulating within that community, and if you're not there, if you're not in those spaces, then you're not going to get that information. And if you don't have that information, you can't act on it to protect your health. Okay, so our tentative answer to why concealment might undermine health, at least the best evidence that we have so far, is that it disconnects us from our communities and thus disconnects us from the good things our communities do for us, like connecting us to information. So that's our tentative answer to question one. But what about our second question here, right? Which health outcomes might concealment undermine? So I ran another set of studies to try to figure out, to which types of health outcomes should this process that I've been talking about, these effects I've been talking about, to which health domains or to which health outcomes should this generalize, right? Remember when I said at the start, does concealment give you the flu? Does concealment give you osteoporosis, right? Like, what are we talking about here? So the rationale that we took to this study was, if concealment undermines health because it cuts people off from information that they might otherwise be able to use to protect their health, then the health domains that it should be relevant for would be the ones where health information is primarily circulating or primarily concentrated within your community. That is, the health domains where you might have a harder time getting that health information outside of your community. For example, during the Mpox outbreak, if you weren't in a community of sexual minority men, you probably didn't know that there were pop-up vaccine clinics available to you because that information was being really specifically marketed towards and thus was really specifically circulating within communities of sexual minority men. Whereas, if you're looking for a flu vaccine, any old person can tell you, where to go to get a flu vaccine because that information is not concentrated in the same way. So what that means that we're looking for here are health domains where knowledge is concentrated within a specific community. So I ran this study where I recruited samples of sexual minority men and straight men because I wanted to compare how knowledgeable sexual minority men and straight men were about a bunch of different health behaviors, about how they could go about engaging in a bunch of different health behaviors. So what you're going to see across the x-axis here are all the different health behaviors that we sampled. And then up and down the y-axis is how knowledgeable both sexual minority and straight men were about how to engage in each of those behaviors. You'll see sexual minority men's scores represented by dark orange bars, and you'll see straight men's, sorry, that's backwards. Sexual minority men will be in dark blue bars, and straight men will be in orange bars. Okay, so first, just going alphabetically here, we said blood pressure testing, right? Do you know how to go about getting a blood pressure test where you are? And as you can see, both sexual minority and straight men reported being very knowledgeable, right? On average, five out of six on a 0 to 6 scale is pretty knowledgeable. About how to get a blood pressure test. And importantly, we didn't see a real difference between sexual minority and straight men here. So they were both equally likely, or at least similarly likely, to know how to get a blood pressure test. We found the same thing for cholesterol testing, COVID vaccination, and flu vaccination. For all of these domains, sexual minority and straight men were similarly confident that they would know how to engage in those types of health behaviors. So we're not seeing very much concentration of health information within the sexual minority community here. For how to go about getting an HIV test, though, sexual minority men reported being more confident that they knew how to get an HIV test if they needed one, compared to straight men, who reported being less confident that they knew how to do that. Same thing was true for Mpox testing, for Mpox vaccination, and the biggest difference that we found was for PrEP use. That's pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. So that's a pill you can take to prevent HIV transmission. We did not find differences for prostate cancer screening, and we did not find differences for STI testing in general. So the places where we found differences between sexual minority and straight men here, right? The places where sexual minority men said that they knew more about how to get or how to access these health behaviors or these health resources were HIV testing, Mpox vaccination, and PrEP use. It is no mistake, right? It's no coincidence that these are health domains where sexual minority men experience health disparities and where health information has been overwhelmingly targeted towards them and marketed towards them, in some cases for decades and in other cases just for a couple years, by public health agencies. Right, so this is information that public health agencies have specifically been trying to get in the hands of sexual minority men, and it looks like it's working because sexual minority men are saying that they do in fact have that information, at least more so than straight men. So, if concealment undermines health because it prevents people from accessing health information that is primarily circulating within the group that they're distancing from, right, the group whose identity they're concealing, that means that we should expect to see the effects that we've been talking about so far emerge in those health domains. So we should find that effect for, PrEP use and for Mpox vaccination, but we probably shouldn't find that same effect for other domains. So we shouldn't find that concealment should undermine health for cholesterol testing, for example. So the last study that I ran was meant to test exactly that. Do we find these relationships that we've been talking about for things like PrEP use, and do we not find these types of relationships for things like cholesterol testing? That would give us a good idea of which types of health domains we are dealing with here. So I collected a sample of just over 1,000 sexual minority men for this study, and we had them answer the same types of scales we've been having them answer, for many of the other studies that I've told you about. So how much are you concealing? How connected do you feel to the sexual minority community? And then we asked them about various health behavior knowledge and health behavior intentions. But to do that, we randomly assigned them to fill out all those, measures to answer our survey in the context of one of two different health behaviors. The first was prep use. So half the participants answered questions about prep use. And we chose prep use because that was the health domain where we found the biggest difference between sexual minority men and straight men's knowledgeability in the last study. The other half were randomly assigned to fill out our surveys in the context of cholesterol testing, which is the health domain for which we found the smallest difference. Um, and maybe no surprise, but good news for the us understanding this phenomenon. We tested the same model among the participants who were assigned to the prep use condition, and the same model for participants who were assigned to the cholesterol testing condition. And we did, in fact, find the exact same results from previous studies for the prep use model. So we did find that concealment was related to lower health behavior intentions when the health behavior in question was going out and getting a vaccine, or sorry, going out and getting a prescription for PrEP. And we found that that relationship was explained by changes in community connectedness and resource knowledge. And we did not find those same relationships in the domain of cholesterol testing. Okay. So I'm going to bring us back one last time to the sort of two questions that have been guiding our conversation so far. The first, right, was why might concealment undermine health? And what we found is that it cuts us off from our communities, and our communities serve lots of important functions for us, including circulating health information that we might not otherwise get. Um, and which health outcomes might concealment undermine? It seems as though the answer might be health outcomes where health information is marketed towards or circulates primarily within the community that we're concealing our identity from. Okay, so why does all this matter? Then we're going to start wrapping up. I think this matters for a lot of different reasons, but I'll give you a couple of specific reasons that I think this should matter to you. Um, so the first is that sexual minorities face substantial health disparities across a really wide range of different health outcomes, meaning that there are health inequities, right? Meaning that sexual minority men have worse health, are less healthy on average than most other groups across a variety of different health outcomes. These health disparities, of course, the reasons for these disparities are multiply determined, right? Meaning there are many different such causes. But many of these causes are unknown or under-researched, right? We know we don't know about all the causes of sexual minority health disparities. And so researching things like concealment that are, commonly used by sexual minorities and that might seem like they're implicated in health somehow, um, might be one key for us to start understanding where these health disparities are coming from. And so ideally, one day we can start doing something about them. Another thing that really excites me about this work, I will say, is that very often when we are doing diversity work, when we're researching minoritized groups, the focus that researchers place is often what's called a deficit model, or they often focus on minority groups' deficits and what we can do as brilliant researchers or as whatever people outside of those groups. The focus is on how people outside those groups can come in and save those members of minority groups from themselves. Right? Very often, that is the way that this type of research is approached. But one of the things that's so exciting to me about this research is that it actually highlights a real strength that minority groups, and in this case, sexual minorities in particular, have within themselves, and that is their connections to each other, right? So we're finding that the way for sexual minority men to keep themselves and keep each other healthy is by strengthening bonds between themselves and other members of their communities. And that is a strength that uniquely belongs to the community themselves. And that's something that really excites me. Okay, so what should we do about all of this? Both what should we as individuals do about all this, and what should society do about this? So the first thing that you can do for yourself is prioritize community, right? Prioritize developing a community for yourself, getting yourself connected to a good community of people who are like you in ways that are important to you. Maybe for you, that means connecting to your local queer community, your local religious community, whatever it is, your ethnic community. But prioritize laying down roots somewhere where there are people who are similar to yourself. Doing so is good for your health. Um, at maybe more of a societal level, I would argue that we need to have people who understand social science in decision-making roles. I mentioned to you earlier on that at the start of the Mpox outbreak, people working in public health were really frantic, trying to scramble and figure out what to do about Mpox because in many even outstanding, hardworking, public health agencies, there just isn't a lot of expertise about how to engage with members of stigmatized groups when there is an outbreak like this one that's targeting a certain stigmatized group. And I know this because my collaborators and I have spent a lot of time talking to people working in public health capacities, to public health officials. Um, uh, uh, about what their experiences during the Mpox outbreak were. And so having people, who understand social science at the table can help explain things like you really need to be taking things like identity concealment into consideration in our response to this outbreak. And then ultimately, the thing that we need to do is we need to reduce the stigma that is causing the concealment to begin with, right? If concealment is so bad for our health, if the reason people are concealing is because they're avoiding stigma, we need to make the world a less stigmatizing place. And that is a responsibility, of course, that falls on all of us. All right, flip side of that, what should we not do about it? What are some takeaways that I do not want you to have at the end of this discussion? The first is we should not just go around telling people to stop concealing their identities. You hear this a lot, especially around things like, National Coming Out Day. There is pressure that is put on people to stop concealing their sexual orientations or their other types of identities. And listen, I am right there with you that, living as your full authentic self for many people, probably for most people, is a great and affirming and joyful thing to do. However, when people are choosing to conceal, they're often doing it for good reasons, right? They might be fearing for their well-being, for their safety, for their dignity. And I think that we owe people the respect of self-determination, right? To respect that they know what's best for them. So we can, support people in coming out, but we should not be telling people to do so. Relatedly, we should not be stigmatizing concealment. I told you earlier that people, when they see concealment happen, they often think that that's a really immoral thing to do. I think we need to sort of move past that because, like I've been saying, when people are concealing, they're usually doing it for a pretty good reason. They're usually trying to protect their well-being. And so I think, we should be extending our empathy to people who are in those types of positions. The last thing that I'm going to talk about today, before I, open it up for questions and discussion, is, what are some things that we don't know for sure yet? The first is one that I've mentioned a couple of times, so this won't come as a surprise for you. We only have causal evidence. That means that we only know that, thing A is causing thing B, rather than things just, correlating with each other. We only have causal evidence for some parts of the processes that I've been laying out today. So we do know that some of these things cause other things, but we don't have the full picture mapped out in a causal way yet. There are a variety of reasons why it's really hard and it's sometimes unethical to do work that would allow us to infer causality with these types of processes and populations. And so it's hard work to do, but I think, the next generation of work in this space is working hard on that. So stay tuned. Another thing, of course, is behavior. Everything that I presented to you today is looking at self-report outcomes. So that's participants telling us whether or not they got a vaccine, rather than us, getting their vaccine records straight from, the vaccine clinic. Obviously, again, that's hard and challenging, and ethically challenging work to do, which is why people tend not to do it so much in this space. But there are some people actually getting creative about that. So hopefully, we're going to deal with that too. Um, Now, one thing I promised you I would talk about is groups other than sexual minority men. So, what do we know about all of this for other members of the sexual and gender minority community? So, we don't know everything. For a variety of reasons, both historically and in recent years, most of this work has been done with sexual minority men as the target population. But we do know some things. So, first, we know that community is good for everyone. It's good for everybody's. So whether you're a sexual minority man, sexual minority woman, gender minority person of any gender, being connected to the queer community, the trans community, other gender minority communities in a way that feels relevant to you is good for your health. It's good for spreading information. It's good for feeling like you belong. It's good for your well-being in all kinds of different ways. We have lots actually of high quality causal evidence for that for all kinds of different groups. We also know that community is important for information transfer for, excuse me, again, for all kinds of different sexual and gender minority communities, as well as for lots of communities outside the sexual and gender minority space. You know, whenever a conversation is happening within a social network, information is being transferred, right? Whether it's something silly and petty like gossip, or whether it's something really important like where you can go, where vaccines are available. Any conversation is an exchange of information. And so being enmeshed within a community that are talking about things that are relevant to your life is good for receiving information that's relevant to you. And lastly, we do know that identity concealment seems to undermine health for most types of concealable stigmatized identities. That includes all sexual and gender minority identities, as well as people like, religious minorities and so on and so forth. There, we don't have causal evidence, but we do at least have lots of evidence for lots of different types of communities. So those are the things that we know for sure generalize to communities other than sexual minority men. Everything else that I've talked about today is stuff that we are still working on. Now, I spent all this time talking about community. So just before I wrap up, I want to acknowledge some of my wonderful community. These 5 people are co-authors and collaborators on different parts of the work that I presented today. So Elizabeth Chan and Rosemary Shepard, who were former undergraduate students that I mentored, who are now phenomenal professionals in their own fields, as well as Neil Lewis Jr., Alison Chastain, and Elizabeth Page Gould. Yeah, 5 outstanding researchers without whom this research would have been impossible. So thank you very much to all of them. With that, I will turn it over to the chat.
Well, Joel, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I really appreciated the way that you illustrated your work, even leaning on those late '90s charts that were a little a little less easy to grok. But that was also just a really nice historical view at kind of where some of this work came from.
Thank you. We gotta, tip our hats to the people who came before us.
Absolutely. People who laid the road down. So let's see here. I will start with a question here actually from myself. So for people who are concealing parts of their identities for good reasons, which you mentioned at the end there, what if anything, can you suggest for those people in terms of anything that they're able to do to affect more positive health outcomes for themselves despite or while they are concealing, if that is a thing that they need to continue to do?
That is such a good question. I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? I will say, so I'm going to kind of dodge your question, but not totally, I promise. I will say that when I think about, okay, if we don't want to discourage people from concealing if that's what they think is best for them, but we do, of course, want to support their health, what can we do in the short term, in the near term? I think the onus there is more on public health agencies and less on the people themselves. And so we need public health agencies to approach health communication in ways that are wise to the experiences of the communities that they are trying to work with. And so if they're working with sexual and gender minorities, for example, that means they need to be aware that not everyone in those communities feels comfortable coming forward, connecting to that community, and so on and so forth. Um, when I went during the Mpox outbreak, I was living in Toronto, and I was curious about how Toronto Public Health, because Toronto was had one of the worst Mpox outbreaks, and so I wanted to know how Toronto Public Health was going about communicating this information to young people who were also disproportionately at risk for Mpox. And so I took a walk around the University of Toronto's campus. University of Toronto is like, it's the largest university in Canada. It's the size of like Texas A&M, like, thousands, tens and tens of thousands of students. Um, I was only able to find one poster anywhere advertising an MPOX clinic, and it was inside the campus queer community center. And so there was like no effort at all that had been made really to communicate to people who might not have been comfortable being in a space like that. No, I don't want to disparage, public health officials as a group here, right? They are working very hard with often, very, very limited resources. And so the reason that they do this type of targeted communication is because A, they don't have unlimited resources, right? It's expensive to take out Super Bowl ads and just tell everyone. And also, we as recipients of that information, we don't have enough mental space to be able to memorize every piece of health information, every possible health issue, right? We do have to be targeted with things that are relevant to us. So it's a tricky position to be in, and I recognize that. But nonetheless, hard work can be worth doing. And so I really think that the onus here is on finding ways to communicate to members of the community that aren't in those physical spaces at the gay bars, in those group chats, and so on and so forth. One other really, quick note about a tangible way that they could go about doing that. Those photos that I showed you of those Mpox vaccine clinics with those lineups down the road on busy city streets, all of those clinics, the only people who were eligible for them were sexual minority men and sex workers. And so if you are someone who, oh, and nurses, I should say. And so if you are someone who is, deeply in the closet and you are not comfortable being identified as a sexual minority man, who greatly outnumber sex workers and nurses in those lineups, you are probably not going to be comfortable getting in a lineup full of other sexual minority men that identifies you as a sexual minority person on a busy city street. And so finding less conspicuous places to put those clinics, finding less conspicuous places to put those lineups, and making sure that you have enough clinics so that the lineups aren't taking hours long and down main roads, are good ways to allow people to feel more empowered to go and seek out those resources.
That all makes a lot of sense. It had me thinking about, how could the landscape potentially be changed if, say for example, it was as easy to walk into any CVS or Rite Aid or Walgreens and get an Mpox vaccine as it is
Mhm.
to walk into those places and get a flu vaccine.
Yeah.
Places that are everywhere and that do not tend to see concentrations of people within specific communities. But
Yeah. Yeah.
sorry,
Sorry, so please go ahead.
I was just going to say how much I, appreciate hearing you say that the onus for this is really on the people doing the public health ed and not the already stigmatized communities.
Yeah. Those people are already doing a lot of work trying to keep it together.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. Well, thank you for that answer. We have another question here coming in through the Q&A. Brett says, wonderful work, Joel. A question, I think you may have discussed this, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about inconsistent concealment across different settings or spaces, i.e. work versus community orgs, and how such selective disclosure impacts mental health.
Mm, that's a really good question. I'll say two things about that. So the first is that yes, that sort of inconsistent concealment between different types of contexts is, exactly what I'm talking about when I say that we tend to talk about concealment in terms of how much do you do it rather than whether or not you do it. It is typically the case that if someone is sort of, getting one of those like middle scores on our concealment scale, right? If they're getting like a medium score for how much they conceal, that usually means that they conceal in some domains of their lives, but not others. Um, and so, what does that do for people's mental health? We know in general that concealing is really bad for people's mental health. In fact, it has much stronger effects on people's mental health than it does on people's physical health. And that is true for primarily things like neurotic disorders like depression and anxiety. Um, so, the extent to which, though, concealment is bad for your mental health in particular, typically is wound up in how much of a burden of inauthenticity and non-belongingness your concealment prompts you to feel.